The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the number on my phone screen was my own. I stared at it for a few seconds, thinking it had to be some kind of glitch or maybe a spam call that somehow spoofed my number. But when I answered, the voice that came through wasn't a telemarketer or a robot. It was me screaming at the top of my lungs, begging for help. Now I know what you're thinking. This sounds like some creepypasta nonsense, or maybe I'm just making this up for views. But I swear on everything I hold dear that what I'm about to tell you actually happened to me. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why I haven't been able to sleep properly for the past 3 weeks. See, I've always been a skeptic when it comes to paranormal stuff. Ghost stories, urban legends, weird phone calls from the beyond. I used to roll my eyes at all of it. But this experience completely shattered my worldview, and I'm still trying to piece together what actually happened that night. The thing is, this wasn't just a one-time occurrence. It was the beginning of something much darker, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. Before I dive into the full story, let me give you some context about my life at the time. I was living alone in a studio apartment downtown, working a dead-end job at a call center during the day and spending my nights gaming or watching Netflix. Pretty mundane existence, right? I had a routine that rarely changed. Wake up, work, come home, eat something from a microwave, and zone out until I fell asleep. The most exciting thing that happened to me in months was when my neighbor's cat somehow got into my apartment through a window I'd left cracked open. That Tuesday started like any other. I'd gotten off work around 6, grabbed some takeout on the way home, and settled in for another evening of mindless entertainment. I remember watching some documentary about unsolved mysteries, which is kind of ironic considering what happened later. Around midnight, I finally decided to call it a night. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas, and climbed into bed with my phone on the nightstand, just like I always did. The first thing that woke me up wasn't the phone call itself, but this weird feeling that something was wrong. You know that sensation you get when you're being watched? It was like that, but amplified. I sat up in bed looking around my dark apartment, trying to figure out what had disturbed my sleep. Everything looked normal. The streetlight outside was casting its usual shadows through my blinds. My furniture was exactly where I'd left it, and there were no strange sounds coming from the hallway. That's when my phone started ringing. The screen lit up and I could see my own contact information displayed. My name, my profile picture, my number. At first I thought maybe I'd somehow pocket-dialed myself, even though that didn't make any logical sense. But the phone kept ringing, and I realized I had to make a choice: answer it or let it go to voicemail. Something inside me, some instinct I can't explain, told me to pick up. So I did. The sound that came through the speaker was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was my voice, but distorted somehow, filled with a terror so raw and primal that it made my blood run cold. The other me was screaming, not just yelling or shouting, but screaming like someone who was being tortured. Between the screams, I could hear words, fragments of sentences that made my heart race. "Help me," the voice pleaded. "Please, you have to help me. It's got me, and I can't get away. I'm trapped, and it's getting closer." I tried to speak, to ask who was calling or what was happening. But every time I opened my mouth, the screaming would get louder, drowning out anything I tried to say. The call lasted maybe 2 minutes, though it felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the line went dead. I sat there in the darkness, staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool temperature in my apartment. I checked my call log, and sure enough, there was a record of an incoming call from my own number at 2:47 a.m. The rational part of my brain was working overtime, trying to come up with logical explanations. Maybe it was a prank call using voice manipulation software. Maybe someone had hacked my phone somehow. Maybe I was having some kind of weird dream or sleep paralysis episode. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations felt right. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, jumping at every small sound. The refrigerator humming, the building settling, cars passing by outside. Everything seemed amplified and threatening. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. Daylight has a way of making the impossible seem less terrifying, and I almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been some kind of elaborate nightmare. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My throat was sore, really sore, like I'd been screaming for hours. I went to the bathroom mirror and opened my mouth, and I could see that my vocal cords were inflamed and irritated. There was no way that could have happened from just sleeping. I called in sick to work that day, which was something I never did. Instead, I spent hours researching online, looking for any explanation that might make sense. I found stories about people receiving calls from deceased relatives, about phone numbers that connected to parallel dimensions, about time loops and alternate realities. Most of it seemed like fiction, but there were enough detailed accounts from seemingly credible people that I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something to it. The second call came 3 days later, at exactly the same time, 2:47 a.m. Same number, same terrifying screams, but this time the message was different. The other me was begging for someone to find him, saying he was lost in some kind of maze or tunnel system. He kept mentioning darkness and something following him, hunting him. The call lasted longer this time, almost 5 minutes, and I could hear what sounded like footsteps echoing in the background. Again, I woke up the next morning with a sore throat and the distinct feeling that I'd been screaming all night, even though I had no memory of it. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, if stress from work or isolation was causing some kind of psychological breakdown. But the call logs were real. The physical symptoms were real, and the terror in that voice, my voice, was absolutely real. By the time the third call came, I was prepared. I had my laptop open, recording software ready, and a list of questions I wanted to ask. But when I answered the phone, something was different. The screaming was more desperate, more panicked, and I could hear something else in the background. A low rumbling sound that seemed to be getting closer. "It found me," the voice gasped between sobs. "It's here and it's angry. I tried to run, but there's nowhere to go. The walls keep changing, and every door I open just leads to more darkness." That's when I heard something that made my blood freeze. In the background, barely audible over the crying and pleading, I could hear another voice. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. It was saying something in a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. The call ended abruptly, and I was left staring at my phone, trying to process what I'd just heard. But this time, something was different. This time, when I checked my call log, there was no record of the call at all. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Not just with the calls themselves, but with reality as I understood it. I started documenting everything, taking screenshots of my phone, recording myself sleeping, even setting up a camera pointed at my bed. I needed proof that this was actually happening, not just for other people, but for my own sanity. The fourth call changed everything. When my phone rang at 2:47 a.m., I was ready with my recording equipment. But this time, when I answered, there was no screaming. Instead, I heard my own voice, calm and measured, speaking in a tone I'd never heard myself use before. "You need to stop answering," the voice said. "Every time you pick up, you're making it worse. You're creating a connection between us, and it's using that connection to find me." I tried to respond, but the voice cut me off. "Listen carefully, because I don't have much time. You're not just talking to another version of yourself, you're talking to someone who made the same mistakes you're making right now." I answered the calls too, and now I'm trapped in this place. It's like a reflection of our world, but twisted. Everything looks familiar, but wrong somehow. The voice paused, and I could hear heavy breathing on the other end. "The thing that's hunting me, it's not from here. It feeds on fear and confusion, and every time you answer these calls, you're feeding it. You're giving it more power to reach across whatever barrier separates us." "Oh, what do I do?" I whispered into the phone. "Don't answer anymore," the voice replied urgently. "Break the pattern, change your routine, get out of that apartment if you can, and whatever you do, don't..." The line went dead, and this time I could hear the dial tone. But when I looked at my phone, it showed the call was still active. The timer was still running, even though there was no sound coming through the speaker. I hung up and immediately started packing. I didn't care if I was overreacting or if this was all some elaborate psychological episode. I threw my essential belongings into a backpack and headed for the door. But as I reached for the handle, my phone started ringing again. This time, the caller ID showed a different number. My work phone. I let it go to voicemail, but it immediately started ringing again. Then my old phone number from college. Then numbers I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. It was like every phone number I'd ever had was calling me simultaneously. I turned off my phone and ran out of the apartment, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove to a 24-hour diner across town and sat in a corner booth trying to figure out what to do next. The place was nearly empty except for a few truckers and a tired-looking waitress who kept refilling my coffee without asking. For the first time in days, I felt somewhat safe. But that feeling didn't last long. Around 3:30 a.m., I noticed something that made my heart sink. The diner's landline phone behind the counter was ringing. The waitress answered it with a cheerful, "Mel's Diner, how can I help you?" But then her expression changed. She looked confused, then concerned, then she hung up and walked over to my table. "Are you okay, hun?" she asked. "There's someone on the phone asking for you, says it's urgent." I shook my head frantically. "I don't know who that could be. I didn't tell anyone I was here." She shrugged and walked back to the counter, but the phone started ringing again immediately. This time, she didn't answer it, but I could see her looking at me with growing suspicion, like maybe I was some kind of trouble she didn't want in her diner. I left a 20 on the table and headed for the door, but as I passed the counter, I could hear something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The phone was still ringing, but now I could hear a faint voice coming through the speaker, even though no one had answered it. It was my voice screaming again, but this time it was different. This time it sounded like it was coming from very far away. I got back in my car and drove aimlessly through the empty streets, trying to think of somewhere safe to go. But everywhere I stopped, phones would start ringing. Gas stations, convenience stores, even payphones on street corners that I was sure hadn't worked in years. The pattern became clear after a few hours. Whatever was happening, it wasn't limited to my personal phone anymore. It was spreading, using every available connection to reach me. I realized that the other version of myself had been right. I had created some kind of link by answering those first calls, and now that link was growing stronger. By sunrise, I was exhausted and desperate. I drove to the outskirts of town to an old campground where I'd gone as a kid. There were no phones there, no cell towers nearby. Nothing electronic except for my car. I thought maybe if I could just break the connection completely, the calls would stop. I was wrong. As I sat on a picnic table watching the sun come up over the trees, I heard something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, barely audible over the wind and the birds, I could hear a phone ringing. It was coming from the old ranger station, a building that had been abandoned for at least a decade. I walked over to investigate, my heart pounding with each step. The door was unlocked, and inside, covered in dust and cobwebs, was an ancient rotary phone. It was ringing, even though there were no phone lines connected to the building. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to that impossible ringing. Finally, against every instinct I had, I picked up the receiver. "Thank you," said my own voice, but it sounded different now. Relieved, almost grateful. "I've been trying to reach you for so long. I think I know how to fix this, but I need you to do exactly what I say." That was 3 weeks ago. I followed the instructions my other self gave me, and the calls stopped. But the solution came with a price that I'm still trying to understand. I can't tell you exactly what I had to do, because explaining it might create the same connection for someone else. All I can say is that sometimes the only way to break a pattern is to become part of it. The calls have stopped, but I'm different now. I can feel something watching me sometimes, something that followed me back from wherever that other version of myself was trapped. And late at night, when I'm alone in the darkness, I sometimes wonder if I'm still the same person who answered that first call, or if I'm something else entirely. If you ever get a phone call from yourself, don't answer it. Trust me on this one, some connections are better left unmade.